Next presentation, we've got two guys from TSB. So we've got Ian and we've got Stuart, who are senior audit managers at TSB Bank, and they're going to talk to us about their continued journey. So Ian has spoken to us before, and these were the sort of earlier stages of their use of IDEA and embedding data analytics. So it's just to see how they've moved on and how they've embedded IDEA and their strategy and lessons learned, and obviously where they are now. So I'll call them up to present.
So it's nice to be back. 2 years ago, we were in Trafalgar Square in a really nice building. And I thought it'd be nice if I kind of caught you up. So I work for TSB. I came from Lloyd's, so 6 years ago, more or less, I sat in an empty room. I'd taken on what was called the leap of faith, which was to leave a bank I'd worked for 28 years, leave a final salary pension scheme behind, work for a bank that I didn't know was going to succeed, for a boss that hadn't yet been appointed, and actually, do I want the job? And I took it. And why did I take it? I call it my midlife crisis. There are very few things in life where you kind of come along and look back and say, why do you do that? Some people in their 40s kind of buy a motor car, move on. You know what I mean? I decided to change pace. I wanted to work for a small audit function. I wanted to have the opportunity to do something that I thought was right, and I met the chief executive of TSB, Paul Pester, and he was going to create a new bank. So I took that meeting and I went away and thought about it. How many times in life will I get a chance to build a whole audit function? How many times in life will I get to see the start-up of a brand new bank? Probably one of the biggest launches of a bank across the world from scratch. So I took that leap and I haven't looked back since. So 6 years later, I'm going to bring you up to date a little bit. So we're going to tell you a little bit about TSB, but really it's in the context of data, because this is a data analytics conference. And so this is our history. So TSB has been on the high street, if you don't know, for over 200 years. It has an ethical background. So Henry Duncan started the bank. It was in this world where most people kept money under their mattresses, and he saw the poor had a need to store their money. So he started these community banks. And you can see on the chart the history of the bank. It was taken over. It was public. It went on the public. It was taken over again. Lloyd's Bank eventually ended up owning this brand, and through the financial crash they were required to sell off some of the things they'd accumulated, and they chose to sell off or float TSB, which is where kind of my journey started, as setting up this audit function. So if you've ever thought about how would you set an audit function up, what are some of the things that you need to do to start that off? I was sitting in an empty room on the 29th of January 13. There was moth-eaten chairs around. I had no employees. Yet I had to have, based on a phone call I had 15 minutes later, an audit plan within 3 weeks. I had to have the function up and running within 3 months. So, boy, that was a leap of faith. Nobody mentioned that on the job description, but hey, we're here. So when I was here 2 years ago, I was talking about the transition we were going to make. TSB was actually floated, but it was running on a competitor's architecture, Lloyds Bank's architecture. We inherited 600 plus systems. The customer record was split across 72 different systems. So I was listening to the presentation this morning thinking, boy, knowing your customer ID is a challenge. And if you've got it split across 72 systems, some of which were 30 years old plus old, imagine the challenges of understanding what happens to that customer transaction. And 2 years ago, we were about to migrate to a new technology platform. And I was talking about some of the challenges I'd had working in a data environment where all those 600 plus systems, you're trying to do data analytics, you're trying to bring in data, you're trying to do joins on that data, you're trying to actually create the audit tests that we were doing at that time. And the world I was hoping to move into, which we now have, which was a new platform. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. I'm going to start with a video about the pace of life. Let's watch this.
The tires are changed at last. A crewman polishes the windshield as Holland moves away just 67 seconds after he stopped.
There we go, the pace of life, right? So kind of felt like that about 5 or 6 years ago. How do I do an audit plan really quickly? Let's just think about technology. So only 2 years ago, I was on a train coming to this conference, right? I had with me my technology at the time, a BlackBerry, would you believe? I had a chunk of plastic, my sturdy laptop, lightweight not, with IDEA on it. It worked. And I was using the latest technology, Windows XP, only 2 years ago. Fast forward in less than 12 months, I took the team from Windows XP to Office 365. We're now using cloud computing. So fast forward to today, I wanted to look at the slides. Do I get my Surface out and have a look at those? I decided not to. I went onto OneDrive, one click, my slides were on my phone. And that's an example of the pace of technology and the pace of life, how it affects me as an individual just working in an organisation. Imagine that in the wider bank. Imagine that now we've got one platform for our customers. Imagine that we can launch a new app within a few days rather than 6 months, as it took not so long ago. That pace of life is not going to get any shorter. And a lot of that's being driven by data. It's being driven by the technology that we give to our people. It's being driven by the technology being run by organisations. And there are risks. If you move from a legacy system, you know, all those complications that were written into that code 30 odd years ago, you've got to try and unravel. And you try and put that onto a modern platform. Modern platforms are great. Microsoft have this concept of evergreen. If you've ever used Office 365, every time you log on, it's a new exciting journey. Have they put a new button on they haven't told me about? And it brings with it challenges, but real opportunities as well. Collaboration, standard architecture for that data, real heritage on that data, lineages they call it in the... You can actually trace it back. So if I think about 6 years ago, I was trying to set an audit function up that was aligned to the organisation, and I drew this picture and I presented it to our audit committee, how I was going to align everything we did as an audit function to the different strategies of the bank. Underlying this, accepting that I had to live within the technology of the time. And you start thinking about the external influences that drove that plan. What can we do? Can I recruit people with data analytics skills? Can I get that IDEA software that I've been used to using for the last few years into my new team? Those are some of the technology things I was trying to overcome. And how do you train people who are new to analytics quickly? What kind of a product would you do that? So I went back to what I was used to. IDEA was really useful for taking an auditor who knows the business, who knows the technology, but needs a little bit of help from a tool to help them analyse the data that's in front of them. I move on to today, me sitting alone in that room. I've now got 45 growing team. We'll be 55 by next year. I look at our world, a data analytics world that's now got a real clear universe. So if you're into your audit methodology, Most audit functions divide their world up into the platforms, the products, the processes, and we call that an audit universe. And we divide that up into 109 entities. So we've got data that tells us about where we might go and audit. We have a rolling plan. So when I started audit, we used to have a 5-year plan. And that plan used to be delivered. Now it's iterative, it's real time, it's responsive. And we're rolling that plan every 6 months to the audit committee, and we're adapting and changing. And we're doing that based on what the business is telling us through our data, what the regulators require us to do. If I think about the people that we've got, I wrote a strategy 2.5 years ago, and I said we need to get more in the game of data analytics. We need more skills, and thankfully I've got one sitting next to me. That's an actual embodiment of the strategy being delivered. We started to recruit data specialists, and Stuart's going to tell you a little bit more about the team and what we do now. But I look for a blend of skills and experience. Banking is complex, laws, regulations, processes, systems, complex things. We've got a lot to deal with. And boy, can we not get it wrong, because the regulators are all over you as soon as you make one mistake. We try and induct people from different backgrounds, but within our teams, we want them to understand and recognise that actually being data literate is now part of being an auditor. You need to really think about everything you do from a data lens. I really like some of the comments this morning about doing a test of 10. I'm a methodology person. I used to do QA. You've got 6 million mortgages and you looked at 10. How realistic was that? And why did you choose those 10? What did you do? And what does it really tell you about that business or that process? We're in a different world now. Our methodology is principle based. I don't set a rule in the methodology about minimum and maximum sample sizes. I want people to follow their nose. I want them to follow the data, but I'd much rather than recognise the risks. If you take 10 at one end versus 100%, I know where I'd like to be. And if it's a regulatory requirement, you better be at the top end nowadays. How do you look at a bank and think about where we want to be? I'm going to talk a little bit more about our strategies in a second. But we still do the same products like most audit functions. If you're a regulated bank, there's something called the CIIA code that sits on top of the IIA standards. That's the Institute of Internal Audit Standards. The CIIA code was brought in after the financial crash, and it requires banks and audit functions to follow a set of standards. And thankfully, I was already doing what it required me to do. I do an annual product that tells the business and the executive what I think of the control framework. We do an annual self-assessment of the audit function, and we do an external quality review every 5 years, and we did our first one last year. So we do all the things that you would expect an audit function to do. But increasingly, we can't do any of those things without data. Data about our own business, data about our own people, our own processes. So we need a tool, and I've always had idea, and we moved with our migration to a corporate license model. We increased the 10 end user items up to 15, and that's enough within a team of 45 to have good coverage. And again, Stuart will tell you a little bit more about that. So that toolkit, though, recognises you need to go with the technology of the business. So we've now got data on SharePoint stored in the cloud, the Microsoft cloud. We've got our own dedicated data centres. So we've got an evolving strategy. So as an audit function, I started to write different strategies. Where do we want to be for different risk types in 3 years? What do we know already based on our audit work? What data can we get that sits behind those strategies? So if you think about something like HR, you can get data on whistleblowing, absenteeism, pay rates. Boy, I don't want to go into the minimum wage piece again. Sounds far too complicated. But payroll, all these wonderful sources of data. And what really should sit behind our audit strategies is a core of data. It allows us to think about what we might want to audit next. I've got two separate different strategies, though, that deal with different things. And the one I presented 2 years ago was our data analytics strategy. It was an analysis of where we are, or where we were then, doing data analytics on some audits with some enabled people to where we want to be in 3 or 4 years' time. And what steps do I need to take the team on that journey? And that's what the data analytics strategy started to deliver, and Stuart is part of that journey. I also wrote a strategy for the function. Where did I want internal audit to be? And I wrote the original one in 2013, and I wanted to pass flying colours and external quality assessment because it's kind of a reflection on us as a team. But I wanted that particularly us to be a skilled audit function. And again, that comes back to data. So if I think about the banking world now and what it means, I don't know how many of you have got an enabled device. If I'd stood at an audience 25 years ago and said, what phone do people have? Or 10 years ago, most people had a Nokia 3210. That was my first phone in the bank, right? It had a battery that lasted over a week. It was absolutely brilliant. It was a brick, but you knew where it was. I didn't lose it very often. You think about your experience as a customer now, all right? Have you ever made a payment on your phone and watched that little hourglass go round just for a few microseconds? And do you start to think, oh my God, has that payment gone through? Why hasn't it gone through instantly? Do you ever sit on the beach and make a payment at a bar and wonder how that might work? What kind of data and systems that might sit behind that? You know, how do you make sure that that payment is accepted? How do you deal with the fact that different countries have different date formats? The company and the data infrastructure that sits behind that experience. So we now expect you'll be able to do everything online 24/7 in real time, and the moment you can't do that instantly, it's suddenly a problem, right? And if you can't make those systems available, then it's a problem for us as a bank. What sits behind this, though, is a revolution on data and infrastructure, and also a revolution on expectations as well. So these connected devices are not going to go away. You know, I can now speak and ask my phone a question. I've turned it off because in case I do that. It changes how we think, and it ought to change how you think as an audit function. What data can you get available in your business? If I think about the business of TSB, when we launched the bank, we thought about the risk of fraud, right? New company, new launch, banking, boy, will you get attacked. And on the day we launched, if you think about the world fraud attacks, 5% of the world is typically a company called Amazon. TSB on that first day of the launch had about 5% of the world attempts. They tried to attack those new systems, right? Think about fraud controls. You may have seen in the press TSB going on about its fraud guarantee. Our new systems have allowed us to take a fresh look at how we manage fraud. We know what device you use. We know where you are. We know how you normally connect. We know your normal spending patterns. So is it the right thing that we do is to use that data to protect you? Is that the ethical thing? And one of the dilemmas I've been thinking about as a strategist within the audit function is what is the right thing? Because there are different pulls on that. Legislation requires you to take that parental protector. If I see a customer spending their money gambling, all right, and we can see that in the data, is it right we should stop them? Or should we just enable them to do that? If that's their money, is it our obligation to say anything? Those pulls on ethics are really interesting. I'm wearing an Apple Watch here. It's probably monitoring my heart rate at this very moment, right? It's probably thinking, boy, he's waffling on again. And Stuart's probably thinking, how long can this guy talk for? Right? When it spots my blood pressure going up, does it take an ethical stance? Yeah. Does it warn me? Does it call a doctor, which it can do? Or does it take a different route? Does it say this is a sales opportunity? Does it start emailing my immediate contacts with advice on wills and things like that? Potential opportunities. Does it look at my spending patterns? Boy, this guy's been ordering pizzas. He's definitely on the road to ruin. Do we send him some ethical diet advice in the interim? All right. Do we contact his lawyer and say you might be needed soon? You could go in lots of directions with this. So data in itself does not change the way that you need to think. So what is right for your business? Is it right you collect that video footage of somebody using a cash point machine? Is it right you collect that spending pattern? And once you've got that data, do you use it for good or evil or harm? Are you required to use that data, or can you use it? And do you take a kind of a Facebook? Well, we put the platform there. It's up to you what you post on there. It doesn't really matter, really, does it? Well, it's kind of working well for Facebook in terms of their reputation at the moment. I think all companies are dealing with that. Do you treat customers equally, or do you try and actually look at it from a customer perspective? What product is right for them? And if you're doing that in the data, are you actually pushing products that they don't really want? How do you present products on the internet? Do you put one item on the screen and actually the better value ones on the second screen, knowing that people only look at the first screen in this micro world? Is that ethically right? So from an auditor perspective, data starts to create challenges. Is the business using the data in the right way? Are we using it in the right way as an audit function? So it was really interesting about somebody else talking this morning about assumptions in data, and I see this all the time. Most audits start with a hypothesis. We put it in the plan because for a reason we thought it was broken, and the auditors start life trying to prove it's broken, or we put it in the plan because we think it's okay but we need to check it. Well, it must be okay then. So all the tests suddenly start about proving it's okay. The parable of the elephant with the people touching the elephant who are blind or blindfolded is a really interesting analogy. Sometimes you pick up a piece of data and it's not the whole story, or you make assumptions about it. And you really need to stand back and ask some real big questions before you even start your data analytics. Have you got a bias in your own perspective? We collect lots of data. Sometimes data's just there for no reason. Somebody wrote it into the code and started collecting it. It has no purpose. Errors get into data that don't get spotted. Suddenly that dashboard on the car that says you're doing 70 miles an hour isn't telling you the truth because the software has gone awry. Officer, that was my defence anyway, but anyway. How can you truly understand what is true and what isn't? We have, all of us, an inherent bias from our upbringing, our perspectives on life. How we look at the world is ingrained within us. Do we take that bias into our analytics is the question I would ask you. So, I think I'm almost on my last slide. I'm going to give Stuart some time to talk. So, I'm in a different world. 2 years on, I've got loads of data to look at. We've got IBM tools that tell us that data lineage. We have our own data warehouse. We have our own real-time systems. We have one platform for our customer. The company is doing cutting-edge stuff, or if you're a Starling bank, something they did yesterday, because these new banks are really quick adopters. And I put on there, if you don't watch out as a big organisation, somebody will take over really quickly. So, selfie, IDs, all of this creates more data, more opportunities to get the customer journey right, which is the right thing to do, but more ethical challenges about what you do with that iris data. Is it ethical that you keep that? So, business intelligence, data analytics, data-enabled people is the currency of auditing now. What do we do with it? I'll hand over to Stuart.
Thanks very much, Ian. Morning, everyone. As Ian mentioned, a couple of years back when he did speak, he talked about the need to develop a data analytics function within the TSB internal audit team. And you're looking at the first member who, on a full-time basis, does nothing but data analytics. I joined September last year, and when I came in, the first thing I wanted to do was just to agree some objectives as where we want to get to. One thing I've been very lucky with is within the audit team, right from the chief audit officer down through the team, everyone has a real appetite for analytics. They want to do more of it. They recognise the benefits of it. So for me, that was a real positive to come into it. But what I wanted to do up front was just agree what the objective would be. So as you can see on the screen, with develop analytics as an efficient, predictive mechanism that's integral to the internal audit methodology. We also want to use it as much as possible across audits. I realise that you can't use analytics on every single audit. It's never possible. But you want to use it in the right way, at the right time, and be as efficient as possible. So as Ian mentioned, a couple of years back he was here and talked about where TSB wanted to get to. When I came in, this is something I've used in previous, is a data analytics maturity model. What you've got on screen is something that came from the Institute of Internal Auditors, and it gives like a 5-stage maturity model for where an organisation can be in relation to how they use analytics as part of their audit function. When I started, say just over a year ago, for me, we certainly weren't in the data analytics naive section at the bottom left. We were data analytically aware. We were doing some things, we had some skills within the function, we were able to add some value, but there was that appetite to develop up that maturity curve to get to a better place in terms of how we use data analytics. And I think it's fair to say over the past year or so we have moved up that curve. We're probably challenging that managed status at the minute, and that's kind of somewhere where we want to get to. But you also have to be conscious that you can't sit still. This is something that's constantly evolving. You've got to keep on top of the technologies that are out there, you've got to keep on top of the data that's in use, you've got to be able to audit through those and have the skills to actually do that. So for me, this was just setting the scene in terms of where are we at the minute. From there, as I joined just over a year ago, I had a few months at the end of 2018 to try and get into things. So the first thing I wanted to do was take the initial strategy that Ian had developed, turn that into something that I owned and was responsible for. Got that agreed with the leadership team within audit, and it was also presented to audit committee for their knowledge and understanding as well. Timing was quite good from my point of view. I joined as we were moving into our 2019 planning process, so that gave me a real opportunity to speak with the leadership team across. We have 6 different audit teams across our function, able to speak to each of those and try and identify where best analytics could be used this year. And that was something which I guess probably previously hadn't been done as early as that. And one of the things for me is getting analytics started as early as possible. So getting those conversations underway a year ago was really important for me. So to get on the front foot, so that when it came to actually doing the audits maybe this time this year, people were already aware, had an idea about what we potentially could do, and then we honed that as we went through the plan of the individual audit stage. Also was able to identify in Q4 last year some audits that for me were very obvious candidates for the use of analytics. So things were to get some quick wins just to build a bit of momentum and then take that into 2019 and really hit this year as hard as we could in that regard. So in terms of the strategy itself, what I've got on screen now are just some of the key points from that overall strategy. Top line, I'll come back to on a later slide, and again the bottom line we'll touch on in the end as well. For me, just to concentrate initially on the centre line there and look at the one right in the middle, obtaining the direct access to data. And it's something which I think the previous speakers, both John and Ian, have mentioned about actually getting access to the right data and how important that is. For us, when I joined, we didn't have the direct access to the warehouse, which Ian has mentioned. So we're in a position where we're reliant on the business providing us data. I'm sure everyone out there knows how difficult that can be. You're not going to get it right the first time. You mightn't get it right the 10th time. It can take a long time. You may have pressure from your audit team saying, where's that data we want to use? Why have you not got it already? The business will be asking, why are you coming back looking for something again? You've got to wrestle with that to get to the point of being able to get the correct data to do the actual test you want to do. So step one for us was actually getting direct access to that data warehouse. And that's proved really useful. It's helped develop the relationship on the left-hand side of that with the Chief Data Officer within the organisation and their wider team to understand better what we've got access to. Ian talked earlier about having previously 72 systems that maybe are now down to 1, but there's still a huge amount of data that's available to us. I can't stand here today and say I understand every single part of the warehouse that we've got access to. It is huge. But we've been able to look at it in pieces as we've gone through our audit plan and start to understand better what we've got access to, because that's going to help us develop, and then we'll touch on some of those later points around potentially doing some continuous auditing, how we're going to use some visualization tools. It's all reliant on one, getting access to the data and then understanding what data you get access to. And that's where IDEA comes in. So we've been using IDEA to assist with our testing where we can for each of the audits that we've looked at. So that's a bit of a feel for what's in our overall strategy. From there, I said I'd come back to the top row of that, and that's around the methodology. So one thing I did mention was, for me, it's really important to get analytics involved as early as possible in an audit. So involved in the planning stage overall for the year and for the rolling 6-monthly basis that we have. But on an individual audit basis, it's important to be out there as quickly and as early as possible. So one of the things we managed to do is to get, as part of our overall methodology, an explicit statement that for every audit, as part of the planning process, there has to be a discussion with myself on whether analytics is feasible on that audit. And that's captured within the planning memo. So that gives me oversight of all the audits to an extent. As I said earlier, I know that not all audits need analytics, so some of those conversations are very short, they're very sweet, because we know it's not going to help in that instance. For example, we may have some mandatory attestations that we have to do on an annual basis. There's no real benefit on analytics being used as part of that at the minute. So those are fairly easy discussions. There's also other easy discussions because they're very obvious candidates for analytics. One we'll come on to later on, we had a payroll audit, makes sense to use analytics on. It's some of those ones in the middle ground where it's about trying to teach the wider audit team the art of the possible. So to get them to understand where analytics could be used. Something I've seen for my years of experience with this is sometimes called this light bulb moment. You'll work with an audit team and a lead auditor and they'll think, analytics, that's not really going to help us. Why would we want to do that? What are the benefits of doing it? You then discuss with them, agree what you'll do. You come back with a finding that they would never have identified otherwise. You're looking at 100% population. There's nothing there that they would ever have found looking at 10, 25, whatever it might be. Then you come to plan the next audit with them, and they're coming to you with ideas of, could we not use analytics for that? Is that something we can actually use now that would help us on this occasion? Because I saw it previously, I was thinking about it. This is something I could really benefit from if you can do that. So that's why having it in the methodology just gets people thinking as early as possible. And I've seen the benefit in that. There's been a few audits where at the start of planning in prior year, we've felt maybe not for analytics, but nothing obvious in that. Then we come into the planning stage for the audit, have some discussions and we identify, actually, there's a population of data there. If we were to look at it in this way, would that help your testing? Could you get benefits from that? Would that save time in the audit overall? Yes, okay, we'll do that. So maybe hadn't planned for it initially, but we can then factor that in over the course of our resourcing for the year and actually undertake that testing for them. So that's been a great step to have that in the methodology. So whilst I was the first recruit into the full-time analytics team within the function, we've also recruited another resource as well. So at the minute there's two of us who are 100% of our time based purely on analytics. We also have a pool of what we've badged data champions. So this is, as I said earlier, we've got 6 specific teams within our audit function. On the bottom right of the screen is the names of each of those teams. And within each of those teams we have a data champion. So they're someone that acts as a conduit between their business and audit area and the central analytics team to get a better understanding of what their data needs are within the audit team and also within their line of the business. We come together on a regular basis, we're able to share good practice. For example, one area might see some really interesting way the business are using data and they want to let the rest of us know how that's taking place. From the central team, we're able to actually feed back to them some of the work we've been doing in other areas, show them some worked examples through IDEA and show them the outputs of what we've been doing. So that's, in terms of methodology and the operating model, that's what we've been able to do over the course of this year. To move into some of the examples directly where we've used IDEA over the course of the last year, the first one I've called out is something which is quite financial services specific. It relates to politically exposed persons, or PEPs. So this is someone who is in a public function. Their role, such as an MP, such as a High Court judge, and from a regulatory perspective, we have to be able to identify and treat those customers appropriately in line with our requirements. So as part of the audit plan for this year, there was an audit on the books where we're going to look at how that process works. In the background, there's a system which takes some reference data from an external source, matches that against our customers and identifies and screens that to identify potential PEPs. There has been some problems with that system, and the audit team, through discussion with ourselves, decided that there would be an opportunity to actually try and recreate what that system does at a high level. So it allowed us the opportunity to take that external source data. So it's from a company called Dow Jones. The reference data, in this instance, it comes in an XML format, so something that IDEA can cope with, which is great. It's also quite large, so it was in excess of 20 million records in total. We're able to bring that into IDEA, And then we had that as our reference data. From our end, I was able then to get customer data. So at the minute, we've got around about 6 million customers roughly in our warehouse. Able to take that information and bring that into IDEA. And the aim was to try and identify all instances of potential PEPs within our customer data to tie that back to the reference data. In order to do that, we had to, and it's been touched on already today, cleanse some of that data. Some of the formats were not necessarily ideal in terms of how it looked at either end. What we wanted to get to was a point where we had some pretty obvious matches and definite PEPs. So we wanted to look at on the basis of people's names, people's dates of birth, and people's nationalities. The issue is that a lot of these people on here may have multiple names, so the reference data would have had multiple names for certain individuals. So we want to try and incorporate all of that. In order to do that, as I say, there was different formats in the data. So what we had to use with an IDEA was the ability to try and remove all uppercase characters, to reduce all the spaces. So we got a string that we could then match against across all of both sets of data. What we found with that was looking at, we badged them as direct matches. So things were very obvious. There was a direct match on date of birth, nationality, and one of their names. One of their full names, if you like. They may have multiple full names that they use. So we then got a group of individuals that we felt were pretty much certain these were going to be PEPs, and then tied that back to our actual systems to say, are we currently flagging them as such? And we found a small population where that wasn't the case. So we had some discussions with the business to agree that there was an issue here. This is something that ended up as an issue that was reported as part of the overall audit report. And they recognised that this type of process hadn't been used. They'd been relying on the system doing what it was supposed to do, but in reality it wasn't quite operating in that way. So what we then did was agree with them a remediation plan as to how they would address that problem. What they did do as part of that was recognise the benefit of what we had done. So this independent view of taking our customer data, taking the reference data, matching it, trying to find some potential ones that they could work on quite quickly to see, are these actually PEPs? And that's resulted in a quarterly control being put in by the business that basically replicates what we had done. So this is taking something that we as audit had suggested and had undertaken. They've now brought it into part of their process. Now, they had designed that themselves. We gave them advice as to what we had done. We didn't just hand over our code and say, there you go, just run that. We let them design it themselves, obviously outside IDEA, because they don't have direct access to that. And they now run this on a quarterly basis. So for us, that was a real positive, a real win for analytics within the function, and also something that showed within the business that there was benefit in some of the analytics that the audit function could perform. The second example is on payroll, so something that will be familiar to pretty much everyone in the room. We've already had the HMRC discussion earlier on as well. This is an audit that was on the plan for this year. It's not an audit that we undertake on an annual basis by any means, and it's something that when we go through planning, it tends to be on the cusp of whether it's above the line or below the line for the audit year. On this occasion, it managed to come above the line, which was great for me because it's a real opportunity, and everyone knows that it's right to do a lot of analytics on. So in this case, what we were able to do was, for a 6-month period, we've got around 9,000 partners, as we call them, our employees. We were able to analyse all the payments that were made to those employees. As part of that, we have to make some submissions to HMRC. So we looked at those standard files that we had to submit. We also looked at the BACS files, which are the actual payments being made to customers. We looked at the standard data that we have as well in the background. And what we wanted to do was to try and validate that the right people were paid the right amount at the right time. And as part of that, we looked at joiners and leavers. We looked at people who are on parental leave. So we're able to take our maternity model. So obviously there's the statutory, but then we have an additional piece that as an organisation we provide to people taking that sort of leave. And then we built a model with an idea that replicated what should happen in that respect. We also looked at pay grades. So were people in the right pay grades? We've got some specific bands that people should be in. Their salary should be within that. If they're not, then there's potentially an issue there. We looked at people who had changed grades over the course of the year. So people may change hours. They may go from 35 hours a week down to 28, for example. And that should have an impact on their pay as well. So you should see that flow through. So what we were able to do across that 6-month period was to provide positive assurance that we were submitting what we needed to HMRC, that all those payments were in line with what they should have been, and we could validate that back. I'd say on the whole, general positive assurance. But again, one of the advantages of the analytics was because we're looking at everything, we could find some little quirks, some anomalies in the data that we weren't expecting to see, which didn't come back to processing and system. It was more manual processes that were taking place before that. So we found some quirks in that, for example, a company car scheme. So we found examples of where that wasn't operating how it should do. So things that would never have identified if we hadn't used analytics as part of the audit. So again, a real positive in that respect. One of the things that was very interesting in what James showed us just before the break in terms of being able to save your equations, save down your macros, etc. This is something we're going to look to do now, because this is our first candidate for continuous auditing. So as part of 2020, we want to do more continuous auditing across the function. And this was ideal for that. It's something where we've done a suite of testing already. We've got that in idea and ready to use again. So what we've agreed with the business, and they see the benefit in it as well, is they'll provide us on a quarterly basis. We're not going to do it every month or week. We figure quarterly is a reasonable time frame to do that. They'll provide us with these standard files that come from, we use SAP as our payroll system. So provide us with standard output reports from that. We'll import that into IDEA. We'll get some standard reference data and recreate these testing. The testing that we performed previously. And what I want to do is produce this dashboard, produce some sort of visual output that makes it a lot easier for people to see how this is operating. And that's the challenge, is to present something like that will evolve over time. So the first time I produce it, I'm hoping it's not going to look the same a year later. These things have to keep moving. There'll be certain risks that payroll function are subject to that may drop in and out over that time. There'll be certain things that we want to look at every quarter to make sure it's operating as it should be. But that's how we feel the dashboard should look over the course of next year. So that's a couple of examples of where we've used IDEA over the course of the last year. The final slide is just giving, again, just a little bit more detail on some of the areas we want to concentrate on in the future. So extend the use of analytics. This is something where I think most people, when they start using analytics in an audit function, they focus on the field work. It's an obvious place to do because you get lots of benefits from doing that. But it's thinking about where it can be used across the rest of the function, how you can use it in a different way. And one of the elements of that is looking at risk assessments. So at the minute, we have our review process on an annual basis, looking at our risk universe, which Ian mentioned. We assess our view on how risky that area is. What I'd like to get to is an ability to have a data feed into that as well, to make it a more rich discussion about, is this actually high rated? Is this area so important to the bank that it's high rated that we have to audit it each year? Have we got any data that could feed into that would back that up, or otherwise? But have that discussion rather than just someone. It's never a discussion that's putting the finger in the air, but it's a discussion where people have subjective views as to whether something's high, medium, or low risk. If there's possible of getting some data feeds that allow that to be a more involved discussion, then that's what I want to get to. As well as that visualization, I mentioned there around continuous auditing and the opportunities there. Some audit reports can be quite dry, quite wordy, and if you get hit with that, you may not want to read through the whole report. You might last as far as the executive summary and then leave it there. So what I want to look to do is to try and use data where we can and use outputs from our analytics to provide a more visual output, something that brings it to life a little bit more. Also allows you to make that a little bit more interactive. So get to the point of presenting an audit to your auditee and actually have something on screen where you can drill down and say, we performed this testing, at an overall level this is what we found, but then if you go into this and you would click through and get down into the real depths of the true exceptions that you want to follow up with them. So these are things that over the course of this year, or course of next year, I want to concentrate a lot more on. And that was pretty much everything that I want to say.
This year would be gregreat.
This year, if I could do that in a few weeks, I would be, I need to clone me at this stage.
It's on camera.
Yeah, it's on camera, okay. So that was everything that I had. I think, Ian, the last slide we have is just if there's any questions from the room, is that?
Yeah. Absolutely. All right, if there's no more questions, I'll say thank you for this.
Thank you.